The title of my paper is not what's in the program. It's Aesthetics of Existence, a Whiteheadian Existential Sensibility, which is, it's very similar to what's in the program. It's just that William James is not in this as much as I had originally planned. Okay, in this paper, I want to give a Whiteheadian cast to our existential situation, emphasizing in particular the aesthetic characterization Whitehead gives of experience. This aesthetic character, derived from our experience of integral creative passage and self-formation, is a prominent factor in Whitehead's metaphysical description of the world. Okay, now the paper proper. The 19th century, in one of its aspects, can be called the century of diagnosis. Thinkers such as Soren Kierkegaard and Friedrich Nietzsche worried about the progress of modern European civilization outstripping humanity's spiritual capabilities. The forces of modernity were, they saw, rending the human person apart and making impotent our inner energies, leading to a dispassionate and stagnating social situation. Kierkegaard, ever concerned with the inwardness of the individual, introduced the ideas of the public and chatter as leveling elements coming to dominate our present age. Nietzsche came to detect a festering sickness of our inner being and a withering of our will to life, and thereby calls for a revaluation of all values to be enacted by those with the spiritual resources to do so. And in the sphere of political economy, but of broad existential import, Karl Marx realized that the alienation of a person from his work, quote, alienates from man his own body, as well as nature outside him, as well as his spiritual being, his human being, end quote. I do not think that these diagnoses have been overturned, but only complicated by the events of the 20th and 21st centuries. In the middle of the 20th century, many of the concerns mentioned above were absorbed into a new philosophical attitude that would come to be called existentialism. Most closely associated with the work of Jean-Paul Sartre, and more contentiously with the work of others, existentialism is a philosophy of lived experience. A careful look at experience reveals two important aspects of the individual: freedom and self-creation. Acknowledging that we are not ready-made, but self-created, opens the door for social, economic, and political forces to impose foreign values upon our lives, distorting the authentic realization of the projects we have chosen for ourselves. With the power to define the self comes the dangers of self-deception, bad faith, and the leveling compulsion of the public, the they. Yet it is our responsibility to choose ourselves and not fade into the crowd. For the fact of our existence is that we are a choice. Though we appear in this world unbidden, what we are is what we make of ourselves given what is at hand. And to close one's eyes to this fact is to succumb to the whim of external forces. The danger, as Kierkegaard pointed out, is that one's individual life will be leveled, impoverished, robbed of vital intensity. The difficulty is remaining authentic to oneself through the trials, enticements, and cornucopias that we experience throughout life. Thinking through the idea of authenticity and the corresponding notion of inauthenticity is central to much existentialist thought. Other characterizing features of existentialism include stressing the finitude and temporality of our being and the anxiety that attends this finitude, acknowledging the irreconcilable fact that we are thrown into a world with which we must come to terms, and emphasizing the role of possibility in establishing projects that transcend our present condition and situation. We are beings of ambiguity, characterized by immanence within the conditions of our existence and by the choice that transcends these conditions. Those familiar with the thought of Alfred North Whitehead will recognize that many of these existentialist themes are prominent in his own philosophy as developed and written during the 1920s and 30s. For example, Whitehead stresses that every actual entity is an individual act of self-creation and self-determination, a creation of value. Determination is a hallmark of actuality, meaning that all actual occasions are inextricably finite. One aspect of this finitude is the temporality of an actuality, a temporality created with the entity that characterizes the process of that entity's coming to be. Such temporality is impossible without constant transaction with possibility or ideality, a process which precipitates the decisions that characterize actual occasions of experience and lures actuality into novelty. Another aspect of an actual occasion's finitude is that it is birthed out of a world that conditions its becoming and perishes back into that world, losing its individual immediacy, its achievement becoming a definite fact left as a further condition for future actualities. Echoing William James and anticipating Merleau-Ponty, Whitehead stresses that the vague aspects of our experience, more so than the clear and distinct ones, are important regions of philosophical insight, especially the vague feelings within and of our bodies. Above all, Whitehead does not want to be narrow in his selection of evidence from lived experience when constructing his philosophical system. In this, he is true to the spirit of William James's radical empiricism. Nevertheless, Whitehead was not an existentialist. He did not write about the above themes in the same way, in the same language, or with the same emphasis as did later existentialist thinkers. Whitehead was a metaphysician. His thought is systematic and technical, his scope grand. But he did have an existential sensibility, meaning he was concerned with and sensitive towards the inner life of human beings, the values and meanings we experience, and the effects of the self, the world, and others upon this life of our experiencing, doing, and undergoing. For Whitehead, this sensibility takes on an aesthetic character, meaning that he finds our situation in the world to be characterized predominantly by aesthetic values. These are values that result from comparison, adjustment, and contrast in unity. Thus, one might say that Whitehead lays the ground for an aesthetics of existence, or metaphysical aesthetics. To draw out what this means and describe how our experience is characterized by aesthetic values is my purpose in this paper. The idea of value is crucial for our discussion, but difficult to define, for the apprehension of this idea is essentially intuitive. The best starting point to be built upon as the discussion progresses is that value is a feeling of worth, positive or negative, that takes some definite form. There is a worthiness to immediate experience in virtue of its immediacy as my experience. And the value of experience is tethered to the things experienced as they are compared to other things experienced, including felt possibilities. From out of this experiential matrix, we become attracted to or repelled from everyday objects, people, places, and activities. For Whitehead, value so permeates actuality that the two terms, value and actuality, are virtually synonymous. In this paper, I begin to ask, how might Whitehead's avowedly metaphysical, systematic way of thinking shed light on our existential situation as finite beings thrown into the world? How might it help us think about and respond to the precipitating crises of modernity? The first step to answering these questions is to become clearer about how Whitehead characterizes our existential situation. For this, we begin by turning to his writings on religion. Many thinkers throughout history have displayed some measure of existential sensibility. It is by no means a modern phenomenon. Indeed, vital strands of religious thought and practice are characterized by such a sensibility, especially within the mystical traditions. The ongoing religious concern with the health and sickness of our souls is a perfect example. So perhaps it is not surprising that Whitehead's existential sensibility is most explicit in his discussions of religion, though it suffuses his entire metaphysics. In what follows, I shall focus on Whitehead's discussion of religious experience and its metaphysical implications, leaving many of his ideas about religious belief, dogma, and God in the background. Whitehead construes religion broadly as, quote, the art and the theory of the internal life of man, so far as it depends on the man himself and on what is permanent in the nature of things, end quote. For now, it will suffice to say that the permanencies in the nature of things involve the constant press of possibilities upon experience. These possibilities are felt in their relevance to the current decisions faced in this moment of self-realization, providing for the emergence of value and giving a continual sense of reaching beyond the present towards novelty. Thus, religion is concerned with the infusion of ideality into actuality, and the individual's role as the site and enaction of this infusion through self-determination. what I want to focus on at present is the emphasis on the internal life of human beings. An important fact to note about the inner life of a human person is that it is, in the first instance, solitary. We are alone. Life, Whitehead writes, is an internal fact for its own sake before it is an external fact relating itself to others." End quote. We do enter into community. We are social beings, but our sociality is not complete. The fact of individuality is that the realization of value, felt and enjoyed, is firstly a private experience born out of a creature's reaction to and decisions about its world. Sociality conditions the incipient occasion, but the decision and final adjustment lies with it alone, disconnected and in isolation. This is a metaphysical rendering of what Whitehead calls, quote, "the awful ultimate fact, which is the human being consciously alone with itself for its own sake," end quote. Solitariness, then, is a major factor of our existential situation, a generic trait that characterizes a certain phase in all experiences. Religion, according to Whitehead, quote, "is what the individual does with his own solitariness," end quote. What occurs within this solitariness such that it can stand as the anchor for religious thought and practice? Whitehead writes, quote, "In its solitariness, the spirit asks, what, in the way of value, is the attainment of life? And it can find no such value till it has merged its individual claim with that of the objective universe. The spirit at once surrenders itself to this universal claim that value must be realized and appropriates it for itself," end quote. That is to say, the drive of interiority is the attainment of value, of individual self-value, an attainment that can only be realized in the context of the values expressed by the antecedent world as taken up and re-evaluated by the solitary spirit. For though value is achieved and enjoyed by the self, it cannot emerge except upon a background of order that contributes to the experienced enjoyment of being a part of, yet also distinct from, that background, that environment. To experience value is to feel this contrast, to feel oneself, to make oneself an individual in the world. This self-valuation is characteristic of actuality, in that to be actual is to take an interest in what one's existence comes to. Such interest, Whitehead writes, quote, "is the ultimate enjoyment of being actual. But the actuality is the enjoyment, and this enjoyment is the experiencing of value," end quote. The aim of religion is to promote the intensity of felt value through a cultivation of an individual's spiritual strength and sensitivity. This sensitivity is directed towards the mutual compatibility of possible values with those presented by the world as the actual ground or the starting point for the process of self-realization. Accordingly, Whitehead writes that what should emerge from religion is individual worth of character. End quote. For character, when taken in a positive sense, strengthens the internal life, which is the self-realization of existence. Worth of character is partially exhibited in the quality of our actions, but fundamentally concerns the way in which the many facts of the world are adjusted, reevaluated, and merged with possibilities in the concrescence of a new occasion of experience. Is this done with care for the many things that are felt to comprise the new occasion, with a deftness that promotes intensity? Or is it a slipshod affair, resulting in a mild feeling of value, perhaps confusion, or worse, boredom? We should note that for Whitehead, worth can be positive or negative, beneficial or harmful. And enjoyment expresses more the immediacy of feeling as mine than it does something necessarily pleasant. Whitehead is clear that, quote, "religion is by no means necessarily good. It may be very evil," end quote. The aim, though, the hope, is that the value and the meaning cultivated is lasting and worthwhile for the one who creates and enjoys it, and that it promotes such feelings in others, not that it is a flash of self-satisfaction that inhibits the realization of value beyond itself. It is within our solitariness that it becomes possible to overcome the leveling influences of human social psychology and even the habitude of our own existence. Whitehead finds most human psychology to be, quote, herd psychology, end quote, though these collective emotions leave untouched the awful fact of our solitariness. Turning towards and coming to inhabit our solitude can be a relief for us, for the commitment to answering the question that rings out of our solitude, what, in the way of value, is the attainment of life, is to consider novel possibilities of value and to work towards the realization of this value through the determination of the self as a process experienced for its own sake. Whitehead wishes us to avoid acquiescing to the habitual simply because it is habitual. At the level of human consciousness, a certain amount of inner strength is necessary to truly engage with novel possibilities. The cultivation of this strength is one task of religion. While solitariness is of religious significance, it is also a moment of aesthetic judgment, determinative of actuality. At this point, it will be helpful to look at two related texts by Whitehead. The first text will help us distill a metaphysical description of the world from what has been discussed thus far. The text reads thus: "The actual world, the world of experiencing and of thinking and of physical activity, is a community of many diverse entities, and these entities contribute to or derogate from the common value of the total community. At the same time, these actual entities are, for themselves, their own value, individual and separable. They add to the common stock, and yet they suffer alone. The world is a scene of solitariness in community." End quote. Though the becoming of an actual entity is characterized by its solitariness, each occasion of experience begins with the broad feeling of its world, prehending every other existent entity, so that it is a microcosm representing in itself the entire all-inclusive universe, and ends by a presentation of its achievement, a new individuality encapsulating its take on the universe for feeling by future occasions. It is in solitude that the occasion adjusts the initial welter of feelings into the richness of an experience and achieves concreteness, actuality. This is the process that embodies creativity and characterizes the world. Yet this process requires its environment, draws its materials from it, contrasts itself with it, and issues back into the community. Thus, quote, "there is no such thing as absolute solitariness," end quote. The creative advance of nature is characterized by many joining and disjoining, concordant and discordant rhythms between solitariness and publicity. The second related text points us towards the next stage of our inquiry into Whitehead's existential sensibility, namely the aesthetic character of existence. This text reads as follows: "The moment of religious consciousness starts from self-valuation, but it broadens into the concept of the world as a realm of adjusted values, mutually intensifying or mutually destructive." End quote. Like the first text, this text emphasizes the movement from the private achievement and enjoyment of value to the community of values formed by the world of such occasions. Religious consciousness incorporates these various levels of value and seeks to cultivate the achievement of intensity. What is suggested by the text, though not explicitly stated, is the aesthetic dimension of the process of actualization, or concrescence. This is the dimension by which the self-creative entity valuates itself and, by passing into the world, contributes to the creation of a world of adjusted values. To adjust is to make and act upon an aesthetic judgment, aiming at aesthetic satisfaction. The aesthetic dimension of experience is the adjustment and contrast enacted such that certain feelings are intensified or reduced so that a complex integral feeling can be achieved, becoming an actual occasion of experience. Instead of allowing a feeling of disappointment and a feeling of joy to inhibit one another, the incipient occasion can foreground the joy upon a background of disappointment, feeling both and allowing the contrast to sweeten the joy. The occasion might also feel the disappointment with more intensity, inhibiting the joy, which also yields an aesthetic satisfaction. Yet, it is only through aesthetic judgment is the determinate unity of experienced actuality possible. The world of such actualities, varied and numerous, is what presents itself for novel synthesis by a new occasion. Thus we can begin to understand what Whitehead meant when he wrote, quote, "The metaphysical doctrine here expounded finds the foundations of the world in the aesthetic experience," end quote. Whitehead thinks that religious consciousness, in its quest to achieve meaningful existence through the introduction of ideality into actuality, reveals pointedly the aesthetic character of experience. Now we shall leave the realm of religious experience aside to discuss the broader idea of aesthetic experience. As an initial and proximate description, we can say that an aesthetic experience is one characterized by a feeling of satisfaction or significance due to the ordering, arrangement, and adjustment of what is felt and the way this feeling is incorporated into the experiencing subject. Walking through the woods, leaves rustling and creatures scurrying, viewing the facades of the Sagrada Familia, listening to the sounds of a city street, participating in the preparation of the evening meal, spending a night tucked away with a book. All can be appreciated aesthetically for the intensity of feeling they can promote in a receptive experiencer. The quality that makes an experience aesthetically satisfying is that it encompasses a variety of details, individually felt and appreciated, which strengthen the feeling of the whole through their contrasts with one another. The web of relations constituting the whole, in turn, heightens our apprehension of the individual significance of the details to the overall pattern of feeling. Thus, the individual notes of a symphony are woven together into a satisfying whole. Yet this unity does not obscure the loveliness of the notes, but actually serves to put the importance of their individuality into relief. In Whitehead's terms, the aim of aesthetic experience is the massiveness and intensity of feeling. Massiveness is, quote, variety of detail with effective contrast, end quote. The effective contrast of the details with one another, promoting rather than hindering intensity of feeling. Intensity is the comparative depth or vivacity of feeling, an idea that abstracts from the qualitative variety of the experience. These two notions, massiveness and intensity, cannot really be separated from one another. Whitehead combines them in the idea of strength. Thus, in an aesthetic experience, what is sought is vivacity that builds upon rather than excludes variety. An experience may be vivid but narrow. The problem here is that the intensity of such an experience fades quickly and it becomes dull, boring, lifeless. There is a richness to a strong aesthetic experience that is worth returning to and that can sustain our future endeavors. Alternatively, an experience can be full of variety, but with few elements standing out in terms of intensity, resulting in mere confusion, inhibition, and indecision. This situation points to the need for an environmental order to serve as the backdrop against which aesthetic experience can emerge. Order allows the variety of the world to enter into experience as contrasts rather than as destructive incompatibilities. We may say, then, that an aesthetic experience is a, quote, feeling arising out of the realization of contrast under identity, end quote, meaning that the occasion of experience agrees with its inherited environment, its past, while combining this agreement with novel effect. Thus, the symphony, experienced as a musical piece emerging out of a cultural tradition, is appreciated for its peculiar sonic and structural qualities as they relate to this tradition, perhaps as a paradigm of excellence, or perhaps as an adventurous leap towards a new style. The power and delicacy of the music is nothing without various interweaving historical environments. As I mentioned earlier, Whitehead thinks that the most far-reaching and broadly applicable character of our experience is its aesthetic quality. His speculative generalization from this idea is that the interweaving of details into patterned contrasts, issuing in an aesthetic unity of feeling, is characteristic of all occasions of experience, all actuality. An aesthetic unity of feeling, or the feeling of many things as one, is the realization of value. This is also called the satisfaction of an occasion of experience. The coming to be of this unity is the process of self-actualization, or concrescence. In the initial phase of concrescence, the actual world is felt in its multiplicity as so many others. The second stage, Whitehead writes, is governed by the private ideal, gradually shaped in the process itself, whereby the many feelings, derivatively felt as alien, are transformed into a unity of aesthetic appreciation immediately felt as private." End quote. In this stage, the world is swathed in the emotional feelings of the potentialities it exhibits, potentialities now felt as potentials for a novel aesthetic unity, a private recreation of the given world. These emotional feelings reevaluate the given world by modifying the intensity with which the many entities of the world are felt. Quote, "They clothe the dry bones with the flesh of a real being, emotional, purposive, appreciative." End quote. This is the phase of inhibitions and intensifications. Quote, "The phase in which blue becomes more intense by reasons of its contrasts, and shape acquires dominance by reason of its loveliness." End quote. This is where the occasion in its solitariness selects, adjusts, omits, and arranges, aiming at an enjoyment of the world, massive and intense, felt as one, felt as beautiful. This aim is enjoyed for its own sake, for the aim at and experience of beauty is self-justified. The aim at aesthetic satisfaction, inherent in the process of concrescence, impels the attainment of order. We can understand the interweaving of aesthetic experience and order by seeing that with no order, there is no world. There is at best a morass of confused and mutually inhibiting feelings. Aesthetic arrangement and adjustment introduces order, a reciprocally reinforcing structure that promotes intensity of feeling. Organization within the incipient occasion thereby produces a strong satisfaction relative to other occasions with weaker aesthetic modifications. Inherited by other occasions, this satisfaction can be reproduced as a strongly felt component within the subjective immediacy of these other occasions, thereby spreading and maintaining order. It is within certainly intricately ordered societies of occasions that the higher phases of experience, including consciousness, become possible. These phases represent the pinnacle of selection, raising into focus and pushing into a vague background. Activities that open the possibility for high contrast aesthetic enjoyment. The realization of order in the world depends upon feeling the plurality of the past and its exhibition of certain dominating values, a dominating character. That is, the press of the past puts its weight behind certain values by reason of their prevalence and intensity among the entities felt by the present occasion. The many modes of order inherited by the present, mathematical, physical, biological, personal, and so on, are appeals by the past to continue its chosen paths. As Whitehead writes, quote, "No actual entity can rise beyond what the actual world as a datum from its standpoint, its actual world, allows it to be." End quote. Inheritance conditions spontaneity, or the originality of decision. Since the initial phase of an experience must conform to the actual world as the ground from which it emerges, these dominating characteristics are continued into the present as material for the aesthetic synthesis, and thus there is an order felt and maintained. Inherited order can be of many levels, from the deep background of the extensive continuum and the specific physical laws that characterize our cosmic epoch, to the laws and customs of a human society, the physiology of this human body, and the way one keeps one's desk arranged. All order, though, finds its root in the inheritance of a world, its modification, and its integration towards the self-creation of a new entity, a new enjoyed value that feels itself of the world and yet contrasts itself with it. Thus, Whitehead writes, "All order is therefore aesthetic order." And this includes moral order, which is, quote, "merely certain aspects of aesthetic order," end quote. For example, Whitehead finds that the doctrine of responsibility is entirely concerned with the successive decisions that modify and reduce the initial welter of feeling into a unity. Thus, quote, the subject is responsible for being what it is in virtue of its feelings, end quote. Responsibility is grounded in the ordering process of aesthetic experience. A dominating environmental order, say a culture, is an aesthetics of existence, nurturing and promoting a certain range of values for realization. An order makes possible certain types and perfections of aesthetic satisfaction. Within any system of order, there is a limitation of possibilities and a promotion of certain ways of being, thus encouraging intensity and discouraging disruptive or inhibitive elements from robbing strength from the satisfactions achievable within that order. These limitations are another expression of the finitude characterizing actual entities. In a world of finite creatures, the idea of the perfection of an aesthetic satisfaction is entirely relative, meaning perfection is an ideal of strength for this incipient occasion given the background of order out of which it emerges. There is no perfect perfection. But in approaching one ideal of perfection, we can feel the enticement of perfections not currently within reach. The idea of a perfection set against the background of a given order is both a lure to its attainment and to its supersession. Promoting some form of order without allowing it to stagnate is to exhibit an aspect of what Whitehead calls, quote, world loyalty, end quote. Such loyalty cannot be understood in a rigid or static sense. For in the flux of circumstance, the, quote, freshness of being evaporates under mere repetition, end quote. No order is complete in its dominance. There is always some discord and imperfection due to the creativity realized in an actual occasion. The reason an occasion is birthed and merits the title of actuality is precisely that it is not a pure repetition, but a new individuality. So, in the creative passage of nature, a rigid and unchanging order that is influential in some society of occasions will eventually become distanced from the wider environment and thus lose its ability to support vivid experiences. There is a craving for novelty. Repetition dulls intensity. Thus, an order must be maintained insofar as it promotes rich aesthetic experiences and be allowed to change to the extent that it does not. The modification of order provides an opportunity for powerful aesthetic satisfaction by opening up a new range of possible experiences for enjoyment. Thus, successful organisms modify their environment. This leads us to understand that an encounter with a different system of value or type of order is not to be avoided, but it is an opportunity for growth. When the meeting is not forthrightly hostile, but approached with a spirit of adventure, discord provides a glimpse of new vistas of experience and offers the possibility of enrichment through the feeling of contrast, rescuing experience from tameness. Following William James, there are possibilities extant, not yet in our present sight. In discussing order, I have mainly been concerned with the press of the past upon the incipient occasion, conditioning its private feelings and the decisions it makes in its solitude. The correlate of this idea is that the present occasion of aesthetic experience insists upon relevance beyond itself. An occasion of experience does not just feel its past as the conditioning ground, but it also feels the future as something to which it can contribute. The future is anticipated, and in this anticipation, we see the becoming occasions aim at transcendence. Projects can be founded, hopes nurtured. Thus, not only is the subject responsible for being what it is in virtue of its own feelings, but, quote, it is also derivatively responsible for the consequences of its existence because they flow from its feelings, end quote. The aesthetic adjustments inherent within the process of self-creation may originate and be immediately enjoyed in solitariness, but it is a feature of aesthetic satisfaction that it bears within itself a claim to universality. An important part of the immediate enjoyment of an actual occasion is the anticipation of its worth beyond itself. This claim to relevance follows upon the contention that aesthetic enjoyment and the aim at beauty are self-justifying. Immanuel Kant expresses this idea of the broad relevance of private aesthetic experience in his critique of the power of judgment, when he says that a judgment of taste necessarily claims universal assent. It is important to note that this is a claim to universality, not an actual or achieved universality. Within the creative process that characterizes nature, this claim is best thought of as an impulse, a desire, an appetition. The beauty enjoyed in this one occasion of experience is felt as worthy of much more than purely individual subjective enjoyment, and in pressing this claim, the occasion expresses itself within the becoming of other occasions. This is the return from solitariness to community and the press of the past upon the present. We might call this the universal appetition of aesthetic satisfaction. This appetition is exhibited by the entity in its perishing, whereby it effects transition to a new entity, passing on the creative urge of actuality. In Whitehead's terminology, universal appetition reveals itself in the perishing occasions becoming objectively immortal. This term, objective immortality, is meant to capture an item's ability to be taken up by and play a role in other occasions of experience once its own immediacy has faded. An occasion perishes, yet remains as a felt component in future occasions, lending its character to the material which an incipient occasion must adjust and integrate. Objective immortality is the expressive capacity of an item, proclaiming to the future that it is worth feeling. In the objective immortality of perishing occasions, we see in germ the functioning of an art object. Adapting a phrase from Religion in the Making, we can say that an art object, experienced and interpreted, extends our, quote, apprehension of the ordered universe by penetrating into the inward nature of the originator of the art object, end quote. The art object was mine. Namely, the now perished complex of aesthetic experiences had during the object's making. Art objects draw into immediate enjoyment connections and relations that might have passed by unconsidered or ignored for whatever reasons. Great art keeps experiences alive in a particularly vivid manner. We can express this point by saying that art objects are eddies in the flow of time. They are gateways into nutritive experience that elsewise might not be available in the present. To be a great art object is to enhance the function of ordinary objective immortality, resisting the dulling influence of time. Art objects allow penetration through time and across space to bring something to the attention of many, to reinforce and heighten our sense of aesthetic satisfaction in the present, or to rattle us and get us thinking about possibilities for the future. A self-creative aesthetic experience is a self-justifying end. The art object it becomes a means to further ends. Thus we see, in an adumbrated form, how Whitehead's appreciation of aesthetic experience suffuses his metaphysics. Aesthetic experience is the link between everyday life, with its joys and sorrows, and the metaphysical description Whitehead gives of the creative passage of the universe. I have just a couple more minutes and I'm done. This is the concluding bit. For Whitehead, our existential situation is fundamentally aesthetic, meaning we are asked and must answer the following question. How do we put ourselves together so as to promote massiveness and depth of feeling? There is no predestined answer to this question. Possibilities abound, conditioned by the play of circumstance, and the aesthetic integration that leads to new value and meaning exhibits a measure of freedom and self-determination. In an occasion of experience, the decision, the aesthetic judgment, is mine. Its pleasure and its pain are mine. Yet even the most intimate look at the self flows out into an awareness of community as part of one's own aesthetic satisfaction and as that to which one's own satisfaction will contribute. Whitehead writes that, quote, the self-enjoyment of an occasion of experience is initiated by an enjoyment at the past as alive in itself and is terminated by an enjoyment of itself as alive in the future, end quote. According to Whitehead, this is the fundamental situation in which we exist. To those who take Whitehead's philosophy seriously, its pervasive emphasis on aesthetic relationships must impact how we think about social and political problems. An aspect of the sickness of modernity, as diagnosed by the thinkers with which I opened this essay, Marx, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche, is the impoverishment of aesthetic experience, that is, the leveling of aesthetic intensity. Providing a balm for this sickness requires a reinvigoration of culture and an increased sensitivity to aesthetic forms and satisfactions, so that a new vivifying order is found to replace that which decays while retaining that which still works. To live aesthetically rich lives, brimming with felt connections and meanings, we must strive to be live creatures in John Dewey's sense. Quote, "The live animal is fully present, all there in all of its actions, in its wary glances, its sharp sniffings, its abrupt cocking of ears. All senses are equally on the qui-vive." End quote. A creature's response to its world, how it understands, moves, behaves, and lives, is aesthetic. It takes in, adjusts, and fashions the present into a unity inclusive of its own original decisions and actions, projecting itself into an uncertain future. Our everyday practical pursuits are characterized by aesthetic considerations and judgments in the broad sense here outlined, not solely those made observing a statue in a museum. Whitehead makes this point by saying that, quote, "When the pragmatist asks whether it works, he is asking whether it issues in aesthetic satisfaction," end quote. As far as philosophical pragmatism is concerned, drawing this connection between working and aesthetic satisfaction is not a stretch once one has read Dewey's Art as Experience. This alertness and sensitivity to the mutual interrelations of things and their possibilities for integration into immediately enjoyed meaning can be called an aesthetic existential sensibility. Whitehead might call such an attitude religious. To be religious in this sense is to cultivate solitariness, one's inner life, so as to yield an aesthetically aware being in the world. This is to become attuned to the grain of things, to show concern for the overall picture and the details and contrasts that comprise it, and to strive after an ideal felt as possible but as yet unrealized, all to promote the deepest, broadest intensity of experience and enjoyment of meaning and value. Aside from certain sections of religion in the making, Whitehead's most forthright expression of his aesthetic existential sensibility is probably the last chapter of Science in the Modern World, titled Requisites for Social Progress. Here he highlights the importance of education in developing such a sensibility and describes the kind of general education that can aid in this project. What is needed most of all is the cultivation of, quote, "habits of aesthetic apprehension," end quote, which will provide the resources for guiding our experiences to fructifying, satisfying, intense ends. Such habits are to be directed not just to the appreciation of normal art objects, such as paintings, but to things such as factories as well. Sensitive aesthetic awareness will aid us in recognizing and understanding the relations of things and the messages that flow along these relations. It will help us transform struggle into nutrition, help us in figuring out how we can organize and adjust the various orders in the social environment such that they can operate in experience as an aesthetic unity and nurture vivid satisfactions without anesthetizing feeling or causing aesthetic destruction. The essence of aesthetic adjustment is conversion, transformation. To so transform our world is the project of creating an ecological civilization, the umbrella topic of this conference. Thank you very much.